Everybody, and welcome to Bedtime Stories with Andreona Garlid, the show where I read you, fully grown adults, bedtime stories. Today we'll be reading from The Golden Curse, a book I wrote, which is available on Amazon in paperback and ebook. I'll be reading for all the characters, even the men, because I don't actually know any actors, even though the part of Freyr, the male romantic lead, would be much better read by Jason Momoa, but I don't know him, being as he's a movie star and I'm a weirdo who talks to puppets. So I'll just use one of those for his part. So anyway, I'm going to be starting where Gilda, our young orphan, has been trapping pelts in the woods all her life to earn money. And she's going to try to buy a nice dress to make a good impression at the village fair, thereby hopefully raising her station in life, but it's not going according to plan. "Mr. Grummold, Mr. Grummold!" she shouted, running to the back of the store where the portly older man was seated, relaxedly smoking his pipe as though the worst thing in the world hadn't just happened. She stopped abruptly in her tracks so as not to get too close. There was significant danger in standing too close to him, or so she'd heard. "Yes, Miss Lillian, slow down before you trip and hurt your pretty little self," he said, gesturing to a chair beside him. He had a bottle of three-penny gin half hidden behind a sack of grain and was drinking from a tin mug. She shook her head. No, thank you, sir. I only wish to ask, sir, if you did not sell the blue silk dress, the one from the mannequin," she asked, her voice anxious. He nodded. "I'm afraid I may well have, my dear, but that dress weren't right for you anyways." He leaned forward as if about to stand. "I find that I have something real special just for you," he said in a conspiratory way. Gilda shook her head. "I'm afraid, sir, that I had scarcely enough coin for that particular dress, and only if you purchased these," Gilda pulled the cottontail pelts from her satchel, "for considerably more than you usually do." She sighed. "I don't have coin for anything specially made." She looked at her feet. She felt utterly dejected and miserable. Mr. Grummold smiled a wide, toothless smile. Years of eating the sweets from the jars on the counter of his own shop had rendered him quite bereft of dentine. "Not even for this?" he asked, opening a box behind the counter and pulling out a beautiful green-gold dress. Gilda's heart stopped. It was perfect, and certainly twice as expensive as the blue one had been. "Oh, sir, it is magnificent, and it pains me greatly to admit this, but I have no hope of affording that," Gilda said sadly. He chuckled. "What if I told you you could have it for no coin at all?" he asked, twirling his pipe with another gummy smile. Gilda took a step back. "Ugh, so this is how the horrid man managed it." "I'm sure I do not know what you mean," Gilda said, backing toward the door. Mr. Grummold stood up. "I think you do, Miss Lillian. I think you do. You're a very pretty girl, too pretty. The kind of pretty that makes a man do out-of-character things. Things that kind of make him wonder if you don't have some powers other girls don't. Almost feels like witchcraft the way you draw a man in. My boy can't eat, can't sleep, can't even think a sane thought in his head for pining after you. Calls out your name in the night like he's possessed or something," Mr. Grummold said as he continued towards her. Gilda was nearly at the door. Mr. Grummold slid a finger along her satiny cheek. "Of a girl's freckle in the sun and you turn gold. Tell me that isn't witchcraft. You don't want to be accused of witchcraft, do you? I hear they've burned quite a collection of 'em not 3 months back over in Brabant. Surely you don't want that. All you have to do is wear this pretty dress free of charge. And when you dance with my boy and he makes this pretty speech to you, be obliging," Mr. Grummold said, reaching for her hand. Gilda snatched it back. "Your son wants to marry me?" she asked in surprise, trying to take the conversation back to a respectable place. His son hadn't spoken a word to her since she was 15. How did he think he could propose to her? Mr. Grummold laughed. "If that's the price one has to pay for your loveliness, yes, then he wants to marry you." He chuckled again. "For myself, I just want you to show an old man some kindness in return for a pretty dress. You don't say a word to my son about the kindness, and I won't say a word to anyone about how you bewitched him or myself." His eyes glistened as he grasped her hand in an attempt to pull her towards him. Gilda took one giant step backwards and straight into something hard and unyielding. Belatedly, she realized it was the chest of a man who had just stepped out from behind a large display of fabric rolls. Gilda made a terrified squeaking noise. She attempted to twist to see who had now sandwiched her in, so she was trapped, but she could not move. Her heart made its way up into her throat. But the man with whom she had backed into didn't try to turn her towards him. Instead, he grasped her arm free of Mr. Grummold's fingers and spun her around so that she was now behind him. He wrapped his long fingers around her wrist so it stayed behind his back. His other hand pushed Mr. Grummold back hard, so the shopkeeper made a satisfying smack noise when he hit his own sales counter. Her rescuer was exceedingly tall and broad-shouldered to the point where she could no longer see Mr. Grummold's crumpled body from behind him. She imagined that Mr. Grummold looked about as surprised as she felt.
"Don't worry, Gilda. I won't harm you,"
her mysterious rescuer assured her. "This don't concern you, Mr. Van Helsted," Mr. Grummold said in a high-pitched voice, as if the wind had been knocked out of him. The exceptionally tall man, presumably Mr. Van Helsted, laughed. It was a warm, woolen sound. He pulled Mr. Grummold to his feet.
"Nonsense. I like to be helpful when I can, and I happen to overhear your little misunderstanding with Gilda here. I thought I might be able to help clear things up," the tall man said with a smile in his voice. "It would never do for a gentleman to stand by when assistance was needed."
Gilda wanted to squirm and see his face, but he was keeping her behind him so firmly with a grip that was vice-like.
"The girl is obviously only here to buy a dress," the man continued. "I'm pretty sure we both know that she has neither the cunning nor the skills to cast any sort of spells. Also, if she were a witch and you were fool enough to speak to her as you did, I'm fairly certain that by now you'd be a toad or some other sort of slimy creature, don't you think?"
Her rescuer ran a hand through his long dark hair with a wry chuckle.
"I suppose in your case a toad would be a tad redundant, but she doesn't strike me as a person who has much imagination."
The man turned towards Gilda. He was the dark man, the one she thought might be a highwayman, although he was probably not a highwayman. He had just saved her. His eyes looked trustworthy, despite his rakish hair and demeaning speech, so she stopped attempting to free herself from his grasp and instead waited to see how he planned to end this confrontation.
"Come here," he said, pulling her back in front of him with a curving whip-like motion of his arm. "You came here to do business, so do it," he said gruffly.
Gilda looked up at him. "What?" she asked. He sighed, as if greatly irritated by her stupidity. He gave a sharp tug to the money belt on her waist. The little bag of coins fell off in his hand.
"You were here to buy the blue dress, and now he has offered you this one instead, yes?"
he asked. She nodded. "Well, sort of, but," Gilda began. "How much had he overheard from behind the rolls of fabric all the way in the back of the store?" Mr. Van Helsted dumped her coins onto the counter with a second violation of her personal space, tugged off the rabbit pelts and laid them next to the coins.
"There, she has paid for her purchase appropriately, and we will be going,"
he said to a startled Mr. Grummold. The tall, dark man picked up the box with the gown inside and resumed his hold on Gilda's arm, propelling her outside the shop. "But, sir, this gown is much more expensive. I can't just—" Gilda said as he forced them out into the street.
"Doesn't your beauty usually get you a discount?"
he said in the same irritated tone, and he looked over his shoulder to see if Mr. Grummold was following them. The very startled older man was not. "I don't know why you're being so condescending. I'm only suggesting that I don't wish to cheat a man out of his livelihood." Gilda tried to process the myriad ridiculous things that had just happened. To her surprise, the man chuckled again. It was a strange, oddly comforting sound, like something she had heard before.
"He's trying to have you burnt at the stake if you won't go to bed with him, and you're worried about cheating him out of a few coins?" he asked. He shook his head. "You're a very strange girl, Gilda. Now get home before you get into any more trouble,"
he said, turning her in the direction of her house. She looked back at him. "You can't say salacious things like that to a girl. It isn't appropriate," Gilda said, still breathing heavily from the ordeal, and the fact that she had laced her corset extra tightly in order to get a slight discount. He hadn't been wrong about that. The man shrugged his very tall shoulders and leaned towards her, close enough that she could smell his strange woodsy smell, like pine needles and cured animal skin.
"That is because I am not a proper man. Now you'd better be off home before you spend any more time in the company of such a man."
He handed her the dress box and turned her by the shoulders again, towards the road leading to the woods.
"And the next time you have a batch of furs, take them to the cobbler. He won't pay as much, but he won't accuse you of any witchcraft either." He gave her a little push between the shoulder blades. "Go on," he said encouragingly.
Gilda didn't feel prepared to argue with a giant man dressed mostly in dark leather, so she nodded and mumbled, "Thank you," before she realized that there was no way he should have pointed her in this direction. No sane person lived outside of town, or on anywhere other than the other side of the village hamlet. No one, aside from her and her gran, lived in the woods. How did he know she ought to take the path through there? Odder still, how did he know her name? He had twice called her Gilda, and she knew she'd never mentioned it to him. She'd never really met him before tonight. Mr. Grummold had called her Miss Leland. She was sure of that. Fear had seared it into her mind. Feeling rather bewildered, she wandered up the steps to her house. Well, if you want to hear more, you'll have to buy the book. Suffice to say, I hope you will enjoy it.